Hello and welcome, Livingston Library patrons. My name is Hilary. I'm from the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts in Madison, coming to you digitally or virtually today since I can't be with you in person. Before we turn to our topic of the day, I'm just going to briefly touch on our museum and our building, shown there in this picture here. Probably something you may have seen if you've ever driven through Madison, and it looks like a church sitting on the corner of Main Street. It has a tower and lots of other architectural features that make it seem like a church. And inside, even more so, with stained glass windows, vaulted arches, and lots of other elements that make it feel very much like it used to be a church. But it was never a church and was in fact Madison's first public library. It was built in 1899 by a man called D. Willis James as a gift to the town of Madison, and it was intentionally built to look like a church. So this picture gives you a little bit of an idea of what the building looked like when it was a library. This was the main reading room. In those early days of the library, you would not be allowed to browse the shelves. You would tell the librarian what book you want. They would get it for you from the book stacks, which are at the very back of this picture, up and down on that balcony type of thing there. They would bring it to you in the reading room, and that's where you would read it. You did have electric lights on those desks and those tables there, so it was a pretty modern building when it was built in 1899 with electricity and radiators. And this was the library for the town of Madison until the mid-1960s, at which point it became too small for this growing town, and the library moved to its current location. So a couple in town who'd been collecting objects from the 18th and 19th century asked the town of Madison if they could use this now empty building to house their collection as a museum. The town said yes, and the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts was founded in 1969. So this picture gives you a little bit better idea of what the interior looks like. You can better appreciate some of the architectural and decorative elements. Of course, a picture doesn't do it justice. I hope you're able to see it in person someday, but it is a beautiful building inside and out. And this picture is kind of taken from the opposite direction of the previous one. We're now looking into the room that was the reading room and is now our gallery that houses changing exhibits, about twice a year, changing to cover different topics related to New Jersey history. And although a lot has changed about our museum in 50 years, we are still dedicated to telling the stories of ordinary New Jerseyans from the 18th and 19th century, to helping connect people to that history. To help with that, we offer a wide range of historical-based programs like this one to help us get engaged with history of all kinds. So that brings us to our topic of today. So this would typically be wedding season, a time when many people are getting married. Unfortunately, that's one of the many things that our current pandemic has curtailed. But it is a time of year when a lot of us are thinking about weddings. And weddings are today a time of happiness. They're a time when family and friends come together to celebrate a couple who's in love and vowing to share their lives together and embarking on that journey. But that was not always the perspective of weddings or marriages. And we have many traditions that we tend to follow in our weddings today. Even people who would not consider themselves particularly traditional tend to follow, but we don't really think about where they came from or why we're following them. So this program is going to look at the origin of some of those traditions. Some are quite old and have origins that seem to have very little relevance for our modern world. Some are a little bit more recent, but we'll take a look, and maybe you'll have a deeper insight next time you go to a wedding or maybe are in a wedding yourself. These traditions are primarily ones that are common within the European or American tradition that we're going to be looking at. Of course, there are different traditions all over the world. We're focusing on the ones most familiar to most of us, but certainly we could do this program for different cultures around the world and look at a whole bunch of different traditions and things as well. So starting with just some basic history of marriage and weddings, it's been around for a long time, the concept of two people joining together. But for most of human history, these unions were for some kind of advantage, whether increasing land, social status, political alliance, wealth, things like that. Marriages were economic transactions. So the idea of romantic love as the primary purpose for marriage is a relatively recent one. It sort of became more popularized in Victorian times. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who are going to come up a lot in this program, had a big role in sort of popularizing that idea of romantic love as part of marriage, or as a key part, in fact, of getting married. But really, for most of human history, and in fact, even after that Victorian period, loving the person you were marrying was maybe a bonus, but certainly not considered a requirement, and certainly not the reason why you chose to get married. And the word wedding, in fact, has that economic nature built right in. So wed is an Anglo-Saxon word for wager or gamble. It sort of represented this vow by the groom to marry this woman, and speaking to her father, and sort of the bride price that was being paid there. So the idea of economics and advantage and agreements being built right into that comes, is right in the word there. And women typically have very little say in these marriages. Sometimes the men don't either. Sometimes the parents arrange the whole thing. But the man is more likely to have a role, a say in his choice of partner rather than the woman. So handfasting is a tradition that goes back to the 12th to 17th century approximately in England. It's just a ceremony that was done as a betrothal ceremony. Now, something to note here, betrothals at that time were legally binding. It's not like an engagement today that's just sort of an informal agreement to say that you will get married. Betrothal was legally binding. Breaking that would be considered a breach of contract. So handfasting was simply the ceremony that went along with that. So that tradition kind of died out, but later on in sort of 18th, 19th century, this idea started to emerge, sort of a romanticized idea that handfasting was this trial period of marriage for a year and a day. So this idea had no basis in fact, but took off and has remained this sort of popular idea even today. So this idea that you could have this trial marriage and go your separate ways at the end of it without any problems. So again, not based in fact, but popularized through the 18th, 19th centuries. And then more recently, handfasting has seen a resurgence in maybe the past 40, 50 years as a tradition as part of modern marriages, where couples literally tie their hands together. You can see in the picture here, sort of representing their union together. Sometimes it's in a figure 8 pattern to the infinity of this. But kind of a misunderstanding or misco-opting of an old tradition. So continuing along this idea of the decision to get married and betrothal is the idea of consent. So this may seem strange to think about, but it was not in fact until the 12th century in Europe that it was required for couples to give verbal consent to get married. So think about that. Before that, there's nothing to stop two people from being essentially forced into marriage. That's not to say that in the 12th century there was no longer marriages that people were not happy about. There are, of course, all sorts of pressure that can be applied to try to get two people to get married. On a very practical level, a woman who refused to marry the person her father wanted had very few options. There wasn't really a whole lot she could necessarily do. So, the practicality of this in terms of expanding choice for women in particular was not that great. But it did mean that theoretically, both parties had to verbally consent to being married, and that they were not supposed to be actually forced into a marriage they didn't want to be in. And this consent, this verbal consent, in the eyes of God, was in fact the only thing required to make a marriage legal. So traditionally there would be some sort of blessing from a priest, maybe witnesses, but that was not required. And in fact, even the betrothal that we talked about, that legally binding betrothal, all that was necessary was for two people to say, in the eyes of God, that they were betrothed, and that was considered sufficient for this legally binding agreement. And if you broke that betrothal, if one of you went on to marry someone else, that could be considered adultery, which was actually a crime. So this idea of consent, and that's all that's required, no witnesses, no legal documents, no priest, is key to this sort of idea of how marriage and betrothals worked at this time, at least in Europe. So at this time also, marriage is primarily a civil thing. We mentioned that the priest might bless it, but it really wasn't a religious ceremony for a long time in European history. So sort of Roman law, Middle Ages, it's not even a sacrament until 1215. And it's not until 1563 that a priest is required to be present at a wedding as a witness. And that's still only within the Catholic tradition. This is after the Reformation, so many Protestant denominations had different rules and practices, but it shows you that this marriage, this union, was very much in the realm of the secular. Two people joining together for the economic, secular, family, political advantages, not related to what the church felt that they should be doing. And this picture here shows, of course, a wealthy couple getting married, but you can see more people around them. You do start to see, as witnesses are required, weddings become more of a public event with more people there rather than simply a private ceremony with maybe a couple people along with the couple getting married. So a lot of what we would think of today as our modern wedding party developed relatively recently, but the idea of having other people dressed similar to the bride and groom goes back a long way to Anglo-Saxon weddings. The idea being that if you had people dressed similar to the couple, evil spirits who wanted to harm the couple would be confused, wouldn't know who the actual couple was, and therefore might not be able to harm them. So that has old origins. We go through a period when weddings don't tend to have a lot of people attending them. That sort of falls off. We saw on the previous slide how particularly wealthier weddings start to have more people, be bigger affairs, and that starts to spread more commonly by the 19th century, as you start to have the wedding being even more public, less of a private affair. This picture here sort of illustrates that shift. But you can see the bridesmaids, the ushers, dress similarly to the bride and groom, a tradition which is very common today. That's sometimes one of the big choices is how similar will the bridesmaids and the best men be dressed to the bride and groom, what will they wear, what colors, and all of that. Having children in the wedding party is something that was supposed to encourage fertility and also be a reminder of what was considered the main purpose of marriage, which is to have children. And certainly from the church's perspective, that was the main purpose of weddings. Many cultures have flowers or plants of some kind as an important part of the wedding ceremony, and that's certainly true today. Flowers tend to play an important role in the aesthetics of any wedding. And this goes back to ancient times when brides might carry garlic or herbs to scare away evil spirits. You may be seeing a trend here where this fear of evil spirits was very common, seemingly targeted often on this couple, and lots of things being used to scare them away and prevent them from harming the new couple. Ancient brides might also have carried sheaves of wheat to symbolize fertility. And this, over time, evolved more into the floral bouquets that we think of today. However, those flowers still had a strong symbolism, which we'll talk about in a moment. So less necessarily for the aesthetics and for what those bouquets symbolized, what the specific flowers symbolized. Now, the throwing of the bouquet, which is often a feature of weddings today, sometimes also the garter, and even the tradition of wedding favors came out of the fact that brides were considered sort of good luck, and anything that came from them also was considered good luck. So the bride would throw her bouquet to prevent people trying to actually take stuff away from her, take stuff off of her, part of her clothing, things like that. Unclear how drastic this might have gotten, but that idea of good luck coming from the bride and the things she wore certainly is the ultimate reason for this. The bridal bouquet certainly became particularly popular with Queen Victoria. We have her to thank for that, in addition to so many other things. And as you're seeing as we go through, and we'll continue to see, Queen Victoria really developed many of what we consider to be staples of weddings today. So just some of the many symbols that flowers have, and not just for weddings, this is in broader culture as well. Thistle for strength and protection. Doesn't seem like the funnest flower to carry, but there you are. Heather for good luck. Sage for longevity and wisdom. Dill for good luck and wealth. Wheat for fertility. Orange blossoms for innocence and fertility. Ivy for fidelity, and lilies for purity. So these strongly symbolic flowers that you'd put in your bouquet to kind of give a specific symbolic bent to your appearance, to your wedding, and for your future marriage. The orange blossoms were something that became popular, again, with Queen Victoria. And that sort of fertility link also came with her. And they took off, and you can see in this picture from about the 1920s, it's a little hard to tell, but this bride does have these sort of fake orange blossoms around her crown, going down her veil. This is definitely something that was very commonly found in wedding attire in the late 19th, early 20th century. So the distaff side. We have, the bride's family and friends on the left, the groom sitting on the right. Not all the time, but this is still pretty common today. So the word distaff originally refers to the stick that flax is wrapped around, flax coming from a flax plant, or ultimately becoming linen, but it's wrapped around this before it's spun. So in this painting here, you can see the tool she has in her left hand is the distaff. So because women were usually the ones doing the spinning, the word distaff kind of became a shorthand for women's work. Chaucer and Shakespeare both use this word in this way. From there, it continues on to just kind of become a shorthand for women in general. And that's how we sort of end up with that association of the left-hand side being where the bride's family sits versus the right for the groom's. The white wedding dress. Not 100%, but certainly most brides today still wear white. This is a relatively recent thing. Prior to the mid-19th century, for most brides, their wedding dress was simply the nicest thing in their closet. There was not a specialized dress for their wedding, and the chances that it were white were pretty small because most people did not have white dresses. It was whatever color their best dress happened to be. So Queen Victoria is certainly the one who first popularized the idea of a white wedding dress, but it's even more complicated really than that, because she certainly came from a tradition much different than your average bride. But she broke with the tradition of wealthy brides as well by having a dress that was more simple than other wealthy brides. I know that it doesn't seem like it, looking at this picture here of her and Albert, that dress is particularly simple, and certainly compared to the dresses of your average woman, it was not. But at this time, wealthy women went over the top, showing off their wealth with ostentatious accessories and materials. And so compared to that, hers was shocking in its simplicity and in being white. That was not what wealthy women wore for their dress, or in fact, any women wore for their wedding dress. It did sort of have this symbolism of purity that she brought along with it. She also used British-made materials. That was important. And she went on to wear this dress many times in the future, including at her Diamond Jubilee. So this was not, even for this wealthy queen, a dress that was used just once, or made and used just once. That's a pretty new concept, that we have a dress specifically for this one day, this one event. But this couple, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who got married in 1840, were extremely popular and just sparked the imagination of first the British public, but it spread beyond that. And brides started copying her. And that color white stuck. And even the style of her dress is still kind of what we think of as the classic wedding dress style. So it very much informed how we think of a wedding dress today. Another reason why white really took off, photography was just starting to emerge at this time, and white would pop in those black and white or sepia-toned photographs in a way that other colors would not. So that probably helped solidify its popularity, and then now it's sort of considered the standard color for a wedding dress. So wearing something different is sort of breaking with that norm, at least within our American European traditions, rather than the norm. There's a long history within European tradition, European culture, of women wearing veils, and not just for weddings. It was a way to denote rank, to indicate respectability and modesty. Ancient Roman women would have worn the veils to indicate fidelity, maybe protection again from that evil eye. And as European culture developed from there, it continued to be a way that women represented their modesty and propriety by having their head covered. So weddings, might be just an extension of this. It wasn't the only time that women were wearing veils. Veils appearing in weddings is something that had fallen out of favor by the 19th century at weddings and outside of weddings. Queen Victoria, this is another thing that she repopularized, and the weddings reemerged as a staple of weddings after that. Now those veils we were talking about, those are not lace. We're talking just cloth veils, cloth head covering, sometimes long, sometimes short. But the lace veil is certainly what we think of for weddings today. Now, legend has it that George Washington's aide fell in love with George Washington's granddaughter when he was passing by her window. She was sitting with lacy curtains. And because that was how he first saw her, she recreated that effect with a lacy veil at their wedding. There's not a lot of evidence to support this, and the lace veil does not really take off after that, but it does make a good story. It does seem more likely that the originator of the lace veil was, again, Queen Victoria, and it popularized from there. Today, the exchange of rings is often an important part of a wedding ceremony, and this has a long origin. Wedding rings probably go back at least to ancient Egypt, where they were symbolizing perpetual love, not that different from today. You can see this 6th century wedding ring, pretty elaborate and ornate, but showing that continuity of tradition. The earliest tradition may have in fact been breaking a coin in half that was given to each couple that evolved into rings from there, but certainly it's a very old tradition. Develops over time through European culture, having other symbolic meanings, fidelity, the exchange becoming more important. And this ring was not necessarily made of a precious metal. It was not necessarily a particularly valuable thing per se in a monetary sense. It could be made of grasses, leather, bone. The idea was its symbolic meaning, not its value as much. Now, the idea of the diamond engagement ring did start to emerge in the 15th century, but it was not really a common thing until the 19th century. There's a couple reasons why it started to take off then. One is that the cost of diamonds started to come down. It became something within reach for a broader segment of the population. Also, diamonds just became more attractive as polishing techniques improved. Unpolished diamonds do not look like much, and without the techniques that we have to give them that brilliant shine, they're maybe not the most desirable thing. Also, that 6-prong mount for diamonds that we consider pretty standard today was only developed in 1886 by Charles Tiffany. And this also helps set it off, make it look as nice and shiny as it is, because it allows the light to filter through from sort of all directions. So it was really after that that diamond engagement rings start to become more common, more expected, something that even people who probably couldn't really afford them would try to acquire this engagement ring, this diamond engagement ring for the person they were proposing to. So most Europeans and Americans wear their wedding ring on the fourth finger of their left hand, what we call the ring finger. That's not true universally. Some cultures wear the wedding ring on the right hand. Some have a transference from the right to the left as part of the ceremony. Lots of different varieties. But within the Western culture, the fourth finger of the left hand is the most common. Now, there's a couple possible reasons for this. The sort of nicer one is that Romans thought that the vein from this finger went directly to the heart. So there's sort of some symbolism of this, connected with love and things like that. On a slightly less positive note, the left hand was considered inferior. So putting a woman's wedding ring on the left hand could be considered symbolic of her subjugation to her husband, and that inferiority that she took on or had inherently when she was wearing that ring. Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. It's a tradition, some superstitions that many people still follow today. It's considered, very important to have all these components, but why? Certainly it's considered to be good luck or bad luck to not have them. There are some sort of specific origins for each piece of this. The something old is supposed to be continuity with the past, your family. Something new is your optimism for the future, looking forward to that. Something borrowed, you're borrowing on someone else's sort of happiness, sort of taking of that. And blue symbolizes fidelity and loyalty as a common symbolism for the color blue. Now the final last phrase, it's not as common, more common in England, maybe in the past, and a sixpence in her shoe. This is sort of for the future prosperity. It was considered good luck to have a coin in the bride's shoe, especially if it was the year of her birth. The tradition of literally jumping over a broom as part of a marriage ceremony is one that's actually found in various cultures historically, including Scottish and Welsh, among the Roma, but it's most well known for its prevalence among slave communities of the American colonies and then the United States. It's unknown whether this is a tradition that was brought over by enslaved people from Africa or one that developed within those communities, but it certainly became a common part of those slave weddings. And this is at a time when those marriages were not legally recognized. So traditions and ceremonies like this gave back some of the agency and control that was denied for so long. Even after the end of slavery, the phrase jumping the broom continued to be used to mean getting married in a lot of cases. And there was a resurgence of popularity of this phrase and in fact this practice after the Roots miniseries and book. And today, many couples, like the ones shown in this picture, do still include jumping over a broom as a literal part of their ceremony to honor their ancestors. So why a broom? Well, there's a lot of symbolism to brooms and outside weddings, and this is why this is a tradition that shows up in a lot of places. But a broom can be sweeping away the past and starting a new life. It can be fertility and prosperity. It can be representing family. It can be representing God, the ties that bind. There's all of these possible symbolic elements to brooms that make it an important part of these ceremonies. So the toast, it's always a big part of any wedding today. Someone stands up, says something hopefully nice about the bride and groom. Everyone toasts and then has a drink to the couple. A very common part of weddings today. And toasting, totally separate from weddings, has a very old origin. Ancient Greeks toasted in the sense of making a toast, what we refer to today. So where the phrasing comes from is the fact that this wine was often pretty acidic, especially that wine drunk by lower class people. So they would put bread, sometimes toasted bread, into that wine to kind of reduce that acidity, make it a little better to taste. So that's where the phrase sort of originated from. Toasting becomes more common. The sort of glass clinking becomes something about the 17th century. You have a height of toasting, as it were, in the United States in about 1880 to 1920, but it is certainly a tradition that continues with and without weddings, but it's usually a feature of all weddings today. Throwing rice, something that's phased out a little bit recently. Sometimes there's other things, maybe bubbles or sparklers or something else like that, usually thrown when the couple is exiting either the church or place where the ceremony has taken place, or maybe even at the end of the reception, something like that. So this also has an ancient origin. So ancient Romans did crumble wheat or barley cakes over the bride's head. It was supposed to, symbolize fertility, good luck. And then those crumbs that had fallen off the bride were there in turn considered good luck by guests who would try to pick them up. So that's where the tradition started from, and eventually evolved into things like rice or paper flowers or petals or other things that can be showered over the couple to kind of symbolize this good luck coming from the people attending your wedding. The tiered wedding cake, another feature of many weddings today. Sometimes there's changes to that, but often is found. And this apparently comes from medieval England, when people would kind of bring their own cakes, some small cakes, to the wedding and pile them up in a really high pile. And it was considered sort of good luck or prosperity for this couple if they could kiss over this towering pile of cakes. Apparently, in about the 1660s, according to legend, a French chef witnessed this and was horrified by this pile, this haphazard pile of cakes, and suggested making something a little bit neater and nicer looking, and perhaps introduced the first tiered wedding cake. If he did, it certainly did not take off for some time. The tradition of tiered wedding cakes doesn't really become widespread at all until the 18th century, and not popular until after, again, Queen Victoria's wedding. So it's to her that we owe this tradition as well. So some kind of shower is often one of the events that leads up to a wedding. And typically a key feature of this is giving lots of presents. And this does relate to the two probable origins for this practice. One is for a woman who did not have a dowry because her family was not wealthy enough to afford one, so her friends would come together to give her one. This was important. A dowry was what you brought to the marriage. Remember that economic transaction, right? The woman has to give something to this bargain. So if you did not have a dowry, it might be hard for you to find a spouse. Perhaps also this evolved out of circumstances when a woman was trying to marry someone that her father did not approve of. So her friends might give her a dowry so that she could marry this person, even though her father was not going to give her the dowry she would otherwise get. Either way, it does seem to relate to the concept of a dowry. And an interesting note on the dowry, we saw way back a German dowry chest. So the dowry was sometimes cash, sometimes livestock, and also often including things that the woman herself made, decorating towels and sheets and things like that she would work hard on, other family members would work hard on. And this made up an important part of what she brought to this marriage. Another important feature, though, is that often in many cultures, legally, this dowry was something that the woman was entitled to if her husband should die. This is times when women often cannot own any property or have any independent wealth. They would lose this when they get married. But upon their husband's death, the dowry, if not something else, would revert to them. So the dowry is an extremely important thing for a woman. So the shower, though, this concept of how we think of the wedding shower evolved much later, in the late 1800s in the US, in fact, among sort of middle upper class women who'd have parties, pretty recognizable probably to us today. And the term shower may have come from them putting little presents in a parasol and sort of ferrying them over, showering them to the bride, the intended recipient. Maybe where it came from, it spread from there. And by the 1930s was a pretty widespread practice that it continues to this day. The honeymoon. Most couples take some kind of honeymoon. What it looks like can vary greatly, but it's pretty common to do some sort of trip or vacation after the wedding. And this is an interesting one where it actually was a figurative phrase before it was a literal one. There is a popular origin story that really has no basis. It's sort of ancient peoples drank this sort of honey wine, this mead for a month or a lunar cycle after the wedding, and that's where the period came from. There's not really any evidence to indicate that that is true, and the phrasing doesn't really appear until much later. So 17th or 18th century, you start to have this phrase be used as sort of the honeymoon period after a wedding. It's a phrasing we still use today, right? You might say the honeymoon period of a new job or something like that. Something where we use this expression figuratively beyond just a wedding. It doesn't start to be used in the sense of a vacation until the 19th century, and even then it takes a little while to evolve. It starts with couples who would go on these bridal tours. Could be more of a vacation sometimes, but often it was visiting family and friends who couldn't come to the wedding. This was wealthy couples who could afford to do this. Probably long. This might even be a couple months or 6 months, a year-long tour even. And then eventually, though, this tradition starts to spread to be some kind of vacation that many couples take, even if they can't afford the sort of grand tour that those wealthy couples took. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the origins of some of our wedding traditions. It's also maybe some food for thought, kind of thinking about which traditions make sense for our culture, for our family, and that we continue to use to honor that, and which traditions perhaps no longer have relevance to our modern world and are simply things that we continue to do because they've always been done that way. In either case, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen here, and I hope to see you in person before too long. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you again.